until the overall settlement is reached. That settlement must mean Israeli withdrawal from all occupied territory that it currently holds since the war in 1967, the release of all political prisoners, and a state for the Palestinians with East Jerusalem as its capital. No justice, no peace. You're not going out of business as a newscaster in Jerusalem anytime soon, believe me.
Well, as usual, you have prompted a huge email response, both for and against you, Mr. Galloway, so we'll leave it there. I have to say that some people might find it offensive when more families are mourning their dead to hear you say that it was a bloody good hiding. So
you don't give a damn. You don't even know about the Palestinian families. You don't even know that they exist. Tell me the name of one member of the 7 members of the same family slaughtered on the beach in Gaza by an Israeli warship. You don't even know their name, but you know the name of every Israeli soldier who's been taken prisoner in this conflict, because you believe, whether you know it or not, that Israeli blood is more valuable than the blood of Lebanese or Palestinians. That's the truth, and the discerning of your viewers already know it.
Welcome to Good Night with George Galloway on the Molucca Red channel on YouTube. Well, nearly 250,000 people have watched these podcasts so far, and I'm hoping that if you enjoy this, you'll pass the word to others, and we can build what is an unfiltered expression of my views. I'm going to talk to you tonight about Palestine, the subject which is dearest to my heart and has been for most of my life. I first became involved in the Palestine question in the midsummer of 1975. A young student, handsome young man called Saad Jabaji came to my office, the Labour Party office in Dundee. I was 21 years old. I was in the office alone as an activist, publishing leaflets in the old-fashioned way, turning a handle on a Gestetner machine through a stencil, publishing leaflets for a meeting or other. He asked if he could talk to the leadership of the party about Palestine. I told him there are no leaders here, but you can talk to me and I will talk to them. He then, on a beautiful sunny day, I still remember it vividly, with the dust drifting in the air, catching the sunlight as it streamed through the window, through the Dundee City Labour Party window. He talked for a long time in a mesmeric way about the disaster which had overcome his people, the Palestinian people. He told me how his country had been wiped off the map, how his people had been scattered to the 4 corners of the earth, without passports, without papers, without status, hunted from pillar to post, regularly subject to massacre from one Arab regime or another, one Arab organization or another, and who lived in their millions under brutal and illegal Israeli occupation in absolute defiance of international law, in defiance of repeated resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. He painted a picture in such a mesmerizing way of the suffering of the Palestinian people that by the time he was finished speaking, I was a fully signed up member of the Palestinian resistance, which I have remained until this day. And as long as God gives me breath, I'll continue to fight for the Palestinian people and their right to return to their home, their right to a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. I first visited the Palestinian Revolution 2 years later, in the summer of 1977. I went with a group which contained a fellow Member of Parliament, incidentally, a man called Richard Burden, with whom I'm no longer on speaking terms, but who has also remained faithful to the Palestinian cause in Parliament and outside, and many others, some of whom went on to some eminence, others disappeared without trace. The experience was life-changing. We lived in a school, girls in one dormitory, guys in another. We met all the Palestinian leaders, including President Arafat, or at least I did, after the rest of them had departed. We met the historic leadership of the Palestinian people, and we met the people themselves in the refugee camps, some of which became like a second home to me. Places like Sabra and Shatila, where an infamous, notorious massacre took place exactly 30 years ago, when thousands of Palestinian refugees were massacred, whilst Israel controlled the perimeter of the camp, refusing to allow anyone to escape and floodlighting the whole camp so that the fascist militiamen could move from house to house, slaughtering women whom they said would never be able to bear any quote-unquote terrorist children in the future, slaughtering children so that they could never grow up to be quote-unquote terrorists. It was a massacre, it was mass murder, most foul. But I grew close to many of the camps. A camp called Ain al-Helwi, the biggest Palestinian camp in Lebanon. A camp called Rashidiyah. But my most searing encounter was with the orphans of a camp called Tel al-Zatar. So profound was the impact of my meeting with those orphans, whose camp had been razed to the ground by the same fascist militiamen, but this time assisted by the former Syrian regime of Hafiz al-Assad, whose army, like Israel's army in Tel al-Zatar, controlled the perimeter of the camp and thus were complicit in more murder, most foul. The children of Tel al-Zatar burned themselves into my mind. They had a bagpipe band, Scottish bagpipe band. Many Palestinians actually are fond of that instrument, but all their equipment had been destroyed in the massacre of the camp. So I set about, when I returned to the country, collecting Scottish bagpipes and other bagpipe band paraphernalia from here and here, and shipped them out to those children in the camps, where, I may tell you, that equipment is still being used today. I have a house in Portugal, which I called Casa Tel al-Zatar. That's how much that camp meant to me, though I never saw it. It had been razed to the ground before I ever got there. And so from 1975 and until now, I have been a partisan for the Palestinian people. It was a fateful decision. When you take up the cudgels for the Palestinian people, you automatically make very powerful enemies. I knew that that would be the case. I didn't know quite how powerful they would be, quite how able to wound they would over the decades since then. More than 35 years. I didn't know how seriously they'd be able to damage me. But they have, and I could show you my scars, though many of you have already seen them, perhaps without realizing that these scars were for that. Why did I dedicate myself to this Palestinian cause? Well, first of all, the injury suffered by the Palestinian people is second to none in our experience for those of us still living. What happened to them was one of the great crimes of the 20th century, bleeding into the 21st. The injury has been enormous. As I said earlier, their country no longer exists. Try looking for Palestine on the map. And the Zionists claimed that Palestine never existed, though there's actually a big mural on the wall of the British Parliament dated 1189, which depicts the so-called Lionheart Richard embarking upon a ship to, you guessed it, Palestine. Palestine always existed, and indeed was fought over by the Crusaders in a war which lasted 200 years. Its significance can hardly be underestimated. It contains, as its capital, the holy city of Jerusalem, sacred to Jews, to Christians, and to Muslims. It contains the historic Mosque of Al-Aqsa, from the roof of which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens and returned with the revelation. Indeed, Muslims used to pray towards Jerusalem, and it remains the third most holy site in Islam after Mecca and Medina themselves. Its significance historically cannot be underestimated, and it's a very beautiful land. You can understand when you see it why the Crusaders wanted it, and you can understand when you see it why the European colonial settlers who began the journey which led to what is now called by some Israel, you can understand why they wanted it too. But it's not just the land, though the land is sacred enough. It's that the people suffered such grievous injury. When you know personally, as I know, 3 generations of refugees living in camps which are scarcely describable, so foul is their condition, so rank, with such smells, with such excruciating crampedness. When you know that a father who has a house in Palestine fled there with his wife and children in 1948 or subsequently, and then had children, and his children had children, and now actually we are beginning to see the emergence of a 4th generation of Palestinians who continue to believe that they come from Haifa or Akkar or Jaffa or Jerusalem or Ramallah, but who have never seen these places. But they still have a key on the wall of their tiny, tiny hovels in these refugee camps, a key to the house in the beautiful land of Palestine, which still belongs to them. Title deeds which demonstrate their ownership of houses and lands. This injury was compounded by the efforts of various Arab regimes to control the Palestinian issue, to control the Palestinian people, to use them and to abuse them, and abuse them to the point of massacre and the sponsorship of massacre. Then you realize the injury has been very extreme indeed. The fact that this injury has been sustained at the hands of people who call themselves, I myself do not accept the nomenclature, but who called themselves the Jewish state, when the Jews suffered the greatest of all crimes in the 20th century, maybe the greatest crime in history, in the Holocaust, just makes it all the harder to bear. The Jews suffered the Holocaust, but not at the hands of the Palestinians. The Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a phenomenon of European Christian civilization, of European fascism, and those who travelled with it, or who turned their eyes away from it, who locked their doors against the victims of it. Some of those countries are now, of course, Israel's greatest supporters. But there's another angle. If not I, a British anti-imperialist, if not I should oppose what happened to the Palestinian people, then who? Because, of course, the Palestinian tragedy was authored in London, in the infamous Balfour Declaration, in which, on behalf of one people, Mr. Balfour, who was an anti-Semite, by the way, who hated Jews, who wanted them out of the country so he'd never have to look upon their faces in England again, when on behalf of one people, Mr. Balfour promised a second people, a group of atheistic Jews who called themselves Zionists, who had no biblical claim to the land of Palestine, for none of them believed in the Bible, who were merely seeking British sponsorship for yet another European colonial settler state, and who did not represent but a tiny fraction of the Jewish people at that time. Because the Jewish people in Europe at that time were amongst the avant-garde of progressive and even revolutionary politics in Europe at that time. They had no intention of accepting the essential thesis of the Zionists, which they share, of course, with the anti-Semites, namely that Jews cannot live in their own countries, the countries of their birth. That anti-Semitism is endemic within European Christian civilization, and that the only thing that can be done is for all the Jews to leave Europe and indeed everywhere else in the world and go and live in somebody else's country. These Zionists represented a tiny fraction of Jewish public opinion at that time. Some of the greatest liberal intellectuals, some of the greatest revolutionary intellectuals, including the titanic Karl Marx himself, were of course Jews who rejected Zionism entirely. They believed that they were European people, that they had the same right to be in Europe as any other people, and that they would ally with others who thought that way to fight racism in all its forms, and in this case its anti-Semitic form. And Mr. Balfour made this promise on behalf of one people to this second people, even though the representatives in front of him did not represent that second people. He promised them the land of a third people, the Palestinians, who were of course not consulted at all. And thus this tragedy began. And all the blood that has flown under the bridge since that Balfour Declaration is a British responsibility. And I have to pass, as a 25-year member of the British Parliament, I have to pass the room every day where Mr. Balfour authored that tragedy. The injury suffered by the Palestinian people is very considerable, but it's the insult added to the injury to which I shall turn next in just a minute. Welcome back to Good Night with George Galloway on the Molucca Red channel. Don't forget, you can follow me on Twitter at George Galloway. You can join me on Facebook. George Galloway MP is the name of the site. We have well over now 90,000 followers on Twitter and well over 90,000 on Facebook, and I do my best to interact with as many of you as possible. And congratulations, by the way, to Martin McGreechan, who was the first person to crack the code in a previous broadcast and who's been sent a book by way of a prize. And don't forget, you can register here at Molucca Red as a follower, as a member of the site, and you'll be notified every time a video blog, a podcast is put up on the channel. Now, I spoke earlier in the first part about the injury that has been suffered by the Palestinian people, driven from their homes, 800,000 of them, by terrorist violence led by the Zionist terror gangs, the Stern Gang and the Irgun, as well as the more official formations of what became the State of Israel, driven out of their land, out of their homes, preceded by massacre to stampede them on their way, and have never been allowed to return, though it is their legal, not to mention their moral right, forever, in perpetuity, to return to the homes from which they were driven. By any standards, that's a big injury. But it's the insult that has been added to the injury, which is, if anything, even harder to bear. The insult is that the victims of this terrorism have been called the terrorists, and the perpetrators of this terrorism have been called the victims of terrorism. It's Kafkaesque. It is the Palestinian people who have lost their land, their homes, their country, and they are blamed. When they try, however pitifully, by armed struggle, to return to their country, they're branded as terrorists. When they try to wake up the world to their tragedy, they are called terrorists. When they more or less abandoned that armed struggle and embarked upon a non-violent course of action, negotiating through the big powers, especially the United States, for the return to them of a tiny sliver of their land that they could call a Palestinian state, without Jerusalem as its capital, and crucially without the right of return of the millions, more than 10 millions now, Palestinians who live outside of Palestine. When they tried that, when they signed for that in the Oslo Agreement on the White House lawn in front of the cameras and witnesses of the world, nothing happened. Not a square centimetre of Palestine has been returned to them. Jerusalem is being Judaized, the Palestinian people ethnically cleansed from it. What they call the West Bank is now festooned with settlements, illegally built, but financed by Western capital and endorsed effectively, even when they say otherwise, by Western political leaders. The West Bank is now a kind of riddle. Find the Palestinian people in the West Bank. Find the road between one Palestinian village or town and another. Hundreds of checkpoints, hundreds of settlements. Illegal settlers from Brooklyn, mostly, living on officially, legally recognized as illegally occupied territory. Is anyone punishing Israel for this? No. Israel is endlessly rewarded. It's the Palestinians who are punished. They were punished, by the way, by my friend behind me, Yasser Arafat's presidency. They were punished during that presidency. So those who say this is about Hamas, to which I shall turn in a minute, are rewriting history. Yasser Arafat, one of the greatest men I have ever met, tried everything he could, first by armed struggle, then by peaceful negotiation, to get back a tiny part of Palestine, and he was murdered for his trouble. They are punished whilst Israel is endlessly rewarded. If the Israeli leadership comes to town, a red carpet is rolled out in every capital in the world to receive them, even though Israel is the world's biggest rogue state, has committed more crimes as a state than any other state, and is in breach of more United Nations resolutions than all the other countries of the United Nations put together. Yet their leaders are received warmly as legitimate statesmen and women, whilst the Palestinian leaders have to beg for an audience, have to prove that they've given up this or that they relinquished this or that they eschew this or that charter or clause in their constitution which binds them to struggle for the return of all their countries. And even then they're usually met at a very low level. The Palestinians are automatically regarded as being potential terrorists, whilst the real terrorists come and go with bags full of loot that they take from Western governments. Israel could not live for 5 minutes if it were not for the $7 billion a year in subvention from public and private funds from the United States alone. Israel is treated by the European Union as if it were a member of the European Union. They are allowed into the Eurovision Song Contest. They play in European football championships. They are treated as a legitimate and as a European state, which, of course, essentially is what Israel is and was, a European colonial settlement, just like the other European colonial settlements in Africa and elsewhere. Now, this insult leads to very terrible miscarriages of justice. I talked earlier about massacre. Let me tell you about the massacre that took place in the camp in Jenin in the last 10 years. In Jenin, which is one of the worst of all the Palestinian refugee camps, 1 square kilometre, 15,000 families living in indescribable squalor. But from the roofs of their hovels, they can actually see their own houses in Haifa, the shining city by the sea. They can see foreigners living in their own homes. They can see foreigners who came from Brooklyn or London or Paris to play in their gardens, to pick the fruits in their gardens. Can you imagine the agony of that? And when Israel invaded the camp and committed a massacre, the United Nations Security Council, in a very rare occurrence, convened on a Saturday night and demanded access for a United Nations Special Commission to go and visit the camp and check on the condition of the refugees, who are, I remind you, an international legal responsibility. Israel told the United Nations to get stuffed, that no UN commission would be allowed in to the camp. Did the UN do anything about that? No, they did not. They accepted it and unpacked their suitcases, and that's where the matter remained. Israel has hundreds of illegally acquired, undeclared, unregulated by treaty nuclear weapons pointed at every capital in the Arab and Muslim world. Is anybody punishing Israel for that? No. They're preparing to make war, having already sanctioned the Islamic Republic of Iran, which does not have any nuclear weapons. How do you even begin to explain that logically? Iran, which is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran, which allows inspections of its peaceful nuclear plants, is sanctioned and threatened with war, while Israel, that would never dream of allowing an inspector in and has illegally acquired hundreds of nuclear weapons, is treated as a regular and welcome state. These double standards are what helps to drive the Muslim world in particular crazy with rage. These double standards, this injustice, this describing of victims as villains and villains as victims is what drives so many Muslims crazy with rage about us and about those double standards. Let me turn now to Gaza. After the death of my friend Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians had an election. It was described by former President Jimmy Carter as pristine, as absolutely clear and absolutely transparent, as absolutely fair and free. The problem was the wrong party won the elections. And our pretense at going around the world making war for democracy suddenly took a dramatic turn. The Palestinian people were to be punished for having voted for a party, Hamas, that America and Israel and Britain didn't like. And so the Palestinian people have remained under siege in Gaza ever since. A blockade which has made the Gaza Strip, where nearly 2 million Palestinians, most of them refugees, live, as simply unlivable, unfit for human habitation. The water, unfit for human consumption. The schools, including the United Nations schools, regularly reduced to ash and rubble by Israeli fighter planes, warships, and heavy artillery. No one bats an eyelid. Even during so-called Operation Cast Lead, when a ferocious assault was launched by people with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, where all the gates were locked so that they could not escape, the ferocious, murderous bombardment, nobody lifted a finger to help these refugees who are an international legal responsibility. Some tell you that this state of siege, this state of endless war is because of Hamas. It predates the very existence of Hamas by many, many decades. I'm not myself a supporter of Hamas. I never have been. I'm a supporter of President Arafat and the man I regard as his legitimate successor, the hero prisoner Marwan Barghouti, serving 99 years in an Israeli dungeon. I'm not a supporter of Hamas, but I am a supporter of democracy, and the only people entitled to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people are the Palestinians themselves. We certainly can't have a democracy where the people who are illegally occupying your land have a right of veto over who you elect as your representatives. The only people who broke the siege on Gaza were people like me and a very few others who are determined to break that siege, even though it meant travelling through Arab dictatorship and many perils and danger, which I have done, I'm proud to say, over and over again. People like me, people like the IHH in Turkey, who launched the Mavi Marmara ship of peaceful volunteers to take aid to a suffering people under siege, and many of them murdered and hundreds of them taken captive as reward for their efforts. The Arab regimes did not lift a finger to help the Palestinian people, although the Arab regimes are more than ready to fight, it seems, against each other. What's the solution to all of this? I'll be right back.
لأجلك يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي، لأجلك يا بهية المساكن، يا زهرة المدائن، يا قدس يا قدس يا قدس يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد. يا ليلة الإسراء، يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، وإنني أصلي. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان، يبكيان لأجل من تشردوا، لأجل أطفال بلا منازل، لأجل من دافع واستشهد في المداخل، واستشهد السلام في وطن السلام، وسقط العدل على المداخل. سقط العدل، سقط العدل، سقط العدل على المداخل. حين هوت مدينة القدس تراجع الحب، وفي قلوب الدنيا استوطنت الحرب. حين هوت مدينة القدس تراجع الحب، وفي قلوب الدنيا استوطنت الحرب. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان، وإنني أصلي. الغضب الساطع هادئ، الغضب من كل طريق بجياد الرهبة وكوجه الله الغامر لن يقفل باب مدينتنا فأنا ذاهبة لأصلي سأدق على الأبواب وسأفتحها الأبواب وستغسل يا نهر الأردن وجهي بمياه قدسية وستمحو يا نهر الأردن آثار القدم الهمجية الغضب الساطع بجياد الرهبة الغضب الساطع بجياد الرهبة وسيهزم وجه القوة سيهزم وجه القوة سيهزم وجه القوة البيت لنا والقدس لنا البيت لنا والقدس لنا وبأيدينا سنعيد بهاء القدس بأيدينا للقدس سلام بأيدينا للقدس سلام بأيدينا للقدس سلام بأيدينا للقدس سلام للقدس سلام للقدس سلام
Welcome back to Good Night with George Galloway on the Malacca Red Channel. I spoke about the injury to the Palestinian people. I spoke about the insult that has been added to that injury. Now I'm going to tell you what needs to happen. And if it doesn't happen, there will be no solution in Palestine. And if there's no solution in Palestine, there'll be no peace in the Middle East. And if there's no peace in the Middle East, there'll be no peace in the world. And we'll remain locked into this confrontation with the Muslim world, with all the danger and damage that that has caused, forever. Every Palestinian in the world has a right to return. That's just a legal fact. Don't tell me it's not workable, because so far no other solution is workable. Somebody said to me on my New York radio show on WBAI.org just yesterday, well, that's unworkable. Surely we need two states. And I asked him, how's that going? And even he had the grace to laugh. There is no two-state solution. The West Bank is unrecognizable as the land that was seized by force of arms illegally in 1967 and has never been given back. The Golan Heights, seized at the same time, an integral part of Syria, has been changed out of all recognition. There is no two-state solution because Israel will never allow a meaningful Palestinian state with the essential characteristics of a state, rather than a collection of Bantustans, like the apartheid regime in South Africa tried as a solution to its crisis with its African majority. Israel will never permit a meaningful, viable Palestinian state involving the West Bank, Gaza, and occupied Jerusalem. So if they will never allow it, and it will never happen, why should I campaign for it? I campaign for the only just and democratic solution, which is this. All the Palestinians must be allowed to return to their homes. Israelis born on the land have rights. No one can tell them to go home. This land is their home. The only solution is obvious, therefore. It's a one-state solution between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, called Israel-Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, where every person, whether Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, has an equal right to live as an equal citizen. One man, one woman, one vote, one government. and a constitution that can easily be crafted to ensure the protection of religious and ethnic minorities within its state. It's the only solution. All other solutions depend on the Palestinians outside not being allowed to return, or depend on the emergent Palestinian state in the two-state solution not really being a state at all. So that's what I fight for. It's democratic and it's just. Who can gainsay that? Who can contradict that? After the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the Boers, the European white settlers in South Africa, approached President Mandela and asked him for the Orange Free State so that they could create a white state there. President Mandela answered, "We don't believe in white states or black states. We just believe in democratic states. And if it's good enough for post-apartheid South Africa, it's good enough for post-apartheid Israel-Palestine." That's my view. Tell me what you think. I've been doing this a long time. I've been involved in this issue since I was 21 years old. The last word on my lips, I pray to God, will be Palestine. Long live Palestine. Free, Arab, dignified. Thawra Hatul Nasser. Thawra Hatul Quds. It's good night. From me, George Galloway.